Welcome to discussions on important components related to African Black psychology. In this unit, we'll talk about the European worldview and Eurocentric race psychology. I am Dr. Slater Sarah. Hey, boos. What y'all been up to? Don't party too hard. Anyway, okay. So we're going to begin to discuss components related to race psychology. And I just realized I forgot to pull up the letter. Anyway, when we deal with race psychology, it's the psychology of racial differences in behavioral, emotional response patterns, cognition, mental ability, along with their biogenetic underpinnings. So we're going to really break this down in this brief mini lecture. But it is important to contextualize why understanding European race psychology is important. For hundreds of years, African people, Black people, have been oppressed throughout the world. The oppression in the Americas specifically have come from the structure of a psychology that seeks to classify African people as inferior. And there is an ongoing or running narrative that African people suffer from some biological inferiority as it relates to intelligence. So in this chapter, we're challenging that notion of Black people being inferior, but most importantly, we're looking at what racial systems help to build the foundation for creating this very false narrative of inferiority of African people. So again, European race psychology, let me go back, is an important component to understanding how African people have been mistreated, but most importantly, how it has been written into the system, American, Western, Eurocentric system, and also reflected throughout the world. So considering the definition of race psychology, there was this movement that ended up being a scientific movement designed to validate the philosophy, speculations, and practices of white, European, racial, and cultural supremacists to emphasize domination over African people in particular, and non-African, but non-whites in general, so people of color. So the goal was to create a narrative and then provide scientific foundation or scientific basis for justifying mistreatment of people of color by articulating, and then scientifically writing that African people are less than, inferior, etc. So this movement is an embedded and a significant part of European race psychology. So the inherent goal of European race psychology was to first and again establish scientific justification for white domination of Africans and other people of color. Also to scientifically establish an empirical relationship between racial characteristics and psychological and behavioral traits and behaviors. Meaning there was an emphasis to associate color with intellectual ability, color with behavior. So based on the color of a person's skin or their phenotype, then the idea was that the behavior would be, behavioral traits would be justified, connected to the individual's color. So this was a movement in European race psychology, again, to establish a psychology of racial differences with the inherent goal of supporting and validating a doctrine of white domination and European supremacy. So this involved an attempt, again, to take these biological, physical characteristics, black, white nose, thick lips, and say that those with these characteristics were inferior, negative, and give a negative connotation to it. So there are clearly racial distinctions between Europeans and other people of color. These racial distinctions were used as a tool to differentiate and then give a hierarchy of better and worse. One example of racial distinction is Sartre, or what Europeans negatively called Hottentot Venus, or Sarah Bartman. She had a physical body that reflected that of an African woman. And as an African woman, she had a large butt, what we call African blessing. And these racial distinctions then cause a European to put her body on display. Other examples of the European worldview in race psychology included the work of Linnaeus. Carl von Linnaeus is important because he's often called the father of taxonomy. And he created a system for naming, ranking, and classifying organisms. He also studied human differences and the inheritance of intelligence. So in Linnaeus's work on the human differences and inheritance of intelligence, he created a classification system that differentiated what human intelligence looked like and how it was different, skull structure being different, and also associated that with the inheritance of intelligence. Benjamin Rush was another important individual who declared that the color of black skin was the cause of a congenital disease called negritude. Benjamin Rush, again, in this classification of negritude, said that it was a cause of a congenital disease. Not that African skin, beautiful, chocolate brown, African melanated skin was a source of power or a source of beauty or even an equal standard to other people of color in their skin. He wanted to classify black skin as a mild form of leprosy, and the only cure was to become white. This gives a charting of, in 1735, Carl von Linnaeus's charting of racial distinctions. And you'll see some descriptions of the behaviors that were associated with these key racial distinctions. For example, Homo americanus was reddish, choleric, erect, tenacious, contented, free, and ruled by customs. You can look at all the other descriptors, but under the African, Homo afer was referred to as black, phlegmatic, indulgent, cunning, slow, negligent, and ruled by caprice. So all very negative terminology to say that this darker complexion then could only be cunning, slow, negligent. Very important to understand how European race psychology created this distinction for the African. This gives another example. And oftentimes we hear or see in history the reflection of your African presentation of the African as being close to, based on European race psychology, being close to monkeys or animals. So European race psychology continued to address the worldview of the African. If we look at the worldview of the European, my grandbaby just tried to come up here. If we continue to think about the worldview, why is that thing right here? Of the European, which we discussed in the previous section. Was that there the whole time? Hello, move. We'll find that the European worldview Oh my gosh. In race psychology addressed intellectual developments that gave rise to this white colonizer tradition in European psychology. Again, we talked about Darwin in our last unit, Galton's hereditary genius. Now, I'm actually intrigued by Galton's work because he argued that we could inherit ability. The challenge with that is that the African was supposed to be cunning, slow, ruled by caprice, was one of the other descriptors. Therefore, the African would not inherit intelligence unless, of course, mating with a white or European. Helmholtz, Mendel's law of genetics all played an important part in our understanding of European race psychology. So race in European Western psychology, again, involved the process of relating psychological traits to behavior and physical characteristics. And the strategy was to study these racial differences, isolate and specifically measure the physical and phenotypic traits. Again, skin color, nose width, lip thickness, hair texture, and then measure certain behavioral traits and associate them with different racial groups, which is another way that these listing of behaviors came about. I don't know why this box is in the way. Get it out. So we'll find that in this isolation and measuring of these phenotypic traits, it presumed that different racial groups, particularly African and European groups, existed in this dichotomy, the end of the spectrum. The European had a larger brain capacity, pointed or narrow nose versus wide, round, and flat. And what was sought after in European race psychology, and we'll continue to talk about eugenics in our next section, the goal was to have or connect the most sought after traits, which were European. The girl coming upstairs threw me all the way off. Okay. So we can look at these and note the differences. Hello. So again, the idea was to look at the phenotypic traits and then study them related to ability, reaction time, board puzzle, pain threshold, visual perception, sound, memory. Oops, I didn't fix that. So one of the things that's very interesting is that there is historically been this narrative that Black African people have a higher pain threshold than other people, but definitely higher pain threshold than European people. This myth has long standing ramifications. First, if we think about African women who are pregnant and go to give birth, it's dangerous. African women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of their white European female counterparts in America. 4 times as much. Black babies die at the same rate, increase. So what is this connected to? We have to think about things that are happening in modern times and then connect the dot. So in this instance, it's very important to note that this European race psychology created this and substantiated scientifically this myth that African people had higher pain thresholds. As a result, or somewhere in there, the scientific world believe that when African women state that they are in pain or something is going on with their body during childbirth or after, the doctors do not listen to the African women. As a result, the African women die. That's serious. So we have to challenge these theoretical perspectives and where they come from. European race psychology, in terms of other demonstrations, empirical demonstrations, attempted to directly connect a relationship between biological and psychological systems and argue in the scientific journals that these conditions or states were genetic in nature. So we are genetically, for example, predisposed as African people, genetically predisposed to higher pain threshold, genetically predisposed to being unintelligent. And this myth, long list myth of who African people were supposed to be, then continued. So people think that that is how African people are. I don't know why there's little stupid things here. So the relationship then was supposed to explain individual differences in adaptive, optimal psychological functioning, ability potential, and behavior, and by implication, maladaptive and suboptimal functioning. So ideally, the optimal functioning would be considered that of the European, and the suboptimal would be all the things connected to the African. Little pause here and pick up. In our next unit, we'll talk about eugenics and the eugenics movement and its impact on African people. Thank you once again. I'm Dr. Slater Sarah.